Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ferki Ferrati. I am the president of the Jefferson Educational Society. Welcome to Global Summit. What is it, 17? Good Lord.
Yep.
You know what that means. I've been here too long. But nonetheless, it's wonderful to welcome you all. Chris Reel and I, Chris is here with us tonight. She was the first chair of the Global Summit, and we started this thing as a 2.5-day conference that brought in a whopping 500 people. And yeah, we thought that was very impressive, actually. We were very happy. So a couple of weeks ago, we had President Obama, and he brought in 8,000 people.
Dear.
And over 1 million views online and about 150 million engagements. So not bad for Erie, Pennsylvania, eh? So, hey, Chris, we started something, eh? But seriously, the Global Summit would not be a success without a heck of a team. And if you see them around, just thank them, because it looks easy. Everybody just assumes that we got to the September 16th, and we had the speaker, but it took months and months of preparation. And our staff, including Ben Spagan, Jake Bartcook, Christine Gerlach, Chelsea Oliver, Pat Cuneo, Time Smiley, Chloe Forbes, D.F. Woodward, and Bailey Kroll, just knocked it out of the park. So I didn't want to miss anybody. So thank you to our team. You have been amazing, and I appreciate you, and so does our board. And I see many of our board members are here. I saw our chairman and secretary and so on and so forth. So we have a wonderful board that enables us to do what we do. So thank you to our board. And literally to the legions of volunteers. The best type of labor, as I say here, is volunteers because our budgets are limited and their time is just as important as money. So thank you to our many, many volunteers for all the work you do. Of course, our sponsors, and some of them have been with us all the way from the beginning, and one of those sponsors is Erie Insurance. Thank you. And of course, Captain Hagen himself. I was not even supposed to be on the stage tonight. I was taking the day off, but the captain called and said he wasn't feeling 100%. So he was not going to bother everybody with the cold that he might have. So he sends you all the best wishes, but he could not be here in person, though he's watching from home, because now the Jefferson program is all live stream as well. But tonight is a very special program, because tonight we are giving out the 2025 Thomas B. Hagen Dignitas Award, which is our most important award here at the Jefferson. And the recipient of that award is Dr. Jane Arbuckle Petro, who joins in a great list of former Erieites and people from Erie that have gone and changed the world in their own professions. So the honor is, as I said, named after Captain Hagen, who is one of our founders here at the Jefferson. He's a visionary leader for our community, a civic champion, and one of Erie's most respected citizens. He continues, by the way, at the age of 90, to be a change agent for this community and bringing this community to where it needs to be as one of the most exciting places in America. So thank you, Captain. And the award honors outstanding individuals who have made significant contributions to the vitality of American democracy. I had to read this part, sorry folks. The Latin word dignitas means first among equals, and was reserved in ancient Greece and later in Rome, the Roman Republic, to describe citizens whose civic behavior exemplified the virtues of dignity and loyalty. Each year, we look for a statuette that is appropriate and that represent the word dignitas and the recipient of that award. In the past, we have used folks like Plato, Athena, Alexander the Great, Cicero, and this year we have chosen Hygeia, the ancient Greek goddess of health. And I'm supposed to show you all. But before we bring in Chris Reel, who is going to do the official introduction, we have a special surprise here for Dr. Jane, and that is Mayor Joe Schember, who's here to make a presentation. Mr. Mayor.
Hello, everyone. I'm really, really honored to be here and I actually have three things to present to her. The first one is probably the most, the thing that's best. It's a proclamation in recognition of Dr. Jane Arbuckle Petro, recipient of the Thomas B. Hagen Dignitas Award. So whereas every year the Thomas B. Hagen Dignitas Award is presented to an Erie citizen who has made significant contributions to our American society. This year's recipient, Dr. Jane Arbuckle Petro, is a native of Erie and a proud graduate of Erie Strong Vincent High School from the class of 1964. She returns to her hometown now to be honored by the Jefferson Education Society with its highest distinction, the Thomas B. Hagen Dignitas Award. Whereas Dr. Petro is a trailblazing plastic surgeon, educator, and author whose professional and humanitarian impact has extended not just in Erie, but across the globe. Whereas Dr. Petro's career spans 4 decades of medical practice and academic leadership. She was the first female plastic surgeon resident at Hershey Medical Center. That was back in 1978. She later became the first female professor of surgery at New York's Medical College. That was in 1969. She has authored 2 books and more than 70 peer-reviewed publications. She's provided medical care on all 7 continents in the world. Whereas Dr. Petro has combined surgical excellence with a commitment to humanitarian service by dedicating herself to serving underserved communities, including children on Medicaid and patients living with HIV or AIDS. She has volunteered her skills to perform reconstructive surgeries for children and marginalized populations and champion compassionate care for HIV-positive patients during the height of the AIDS epidemic. Now, therefore, I, Joseph E. Schember, Mayor of the United States, that's in my mind, but I'm mayor of the city of Erie. On this 14th day of October 2025, I hereby commend Dr. Petro for her continued dedication, where her life's work exemplifies perseverance, compassion, and service. Dr. Petro, congratulations on this well-deserved Thomas B. Hagen Dignitas Award. We are grateful for your service and for globally representing the city of Erie and becoming a role model for Erie residents by leading a life dedicated to community and humanity. The next 2 things won't take us long, I can assure you that. But the first thing I have is one of our keys to the city for her. And it's got the seal of the city of Erie, Pennsylvania, and it's dated the date we were first brought into. So I'm going to set that to you as well. And last but not least, I've always been a little bit of a pen freak. I always have all these pens, and people love them. That's my experience. And the new pens, the most recent ones that I got, they light up now. And what they say on there is it's got my name. And it says, "Thank you for making my 8 years as mayor of Erie a great time for all that we have accomplished." So what I'm going to give her is one of each color. So there's 5 of the pens. And I'm very, very honored to be here with you and with all of you as well. Thank you very much.
So, can you get that step I didn't? But she be good. So, listen, that there, and I want to get it.
So it just so happens that Janie Arbuckle and I have been friends since our births. Before that, our fathers grew up together on Vermont Avenue and were little boys together, and also graduated from Strong Vincent in the 1940s. Swimming and sailing in the Bay were just what they did, and it became a family tradition. Janie's mother, my Aunt Ginny, was my mom's really smart friend, just as Jane was one of my really smart friends, most of whom are here tonight. They did the Sunday New York Times together on Monday mornings over the phone for 50 years. And later on, you will see, I think, a picture of Jane and me when we were 2 at a birthday party. So our lives have been intertwined ever since. Dr. Petro's life and work can be summed up in 2 powerful words. These are my choice. Mayor used a couple of other ones. Compassion and fearlessness. In her more than 40 years as a surgeon, educator, and author, she has demonstrated compassion and fearlessness again and again and again. I'm going to skip most of the rest of the details, or I'll go really quickly. She graduated from Strong Vincent. She went to Eckerd College, which at the time was Florida Presbyterian College. I understand it was as far as she could get away and still be in a Presbyterian college. She's now on the Board of Trustees. Yes?
No longer.
No longer, but was, and teaches there often down in St. Petersburg. After medical school, or after college, she went to Eisenhower Medical School, which I believe was brand new. You heard about that. And she has done everything from healing burn victims and reattaching arms, among other limbs. I will not mention the other thing I know about. As a hospital surgeon to performing facelifts and tummy tucks in private practice as a plastic surgeon. Her can-do experience, spirit, and compassionate nature are what led Jane to volunteer early on at the Blythedale Children's Hospital in New York, where she provided care to, and you try repeating this after me, cleft lip and cleft palate patients on Medicaid. She was a champion, as you heard, of HIV-positive patients during the AIDS crisis and became the AIDS general surgeon for a New York medical school hospital. Her achievements went beyond medicine, as you heard. She taught for many years. And in short, Jane has achieved greatness in multiple fields. She is truly a daughter of Erie. So it's my distinct pleasure to present the 2025 Thomas B. Hagen Dignitas Award to Dr. Jane Arbuckle Petro, my friend.
And that's supposed to bladder by her head. Okay, but okay. This is terrific.
There you go, Grace.
I can't thank you all enough, and if we can bring up my slides, I have a lot I want to cover, and I don't want to take too long because I hear there's questions and answers, and I can hardly wait to hear what you ask. And this will be the forward. We got it. Sounds good. So when they offered me this award, I said, you have to be kidding. I don't deserve this. I looked at the previous awardees that they had up there earlier, and I thought, how can I stand with this company? But Chris twisted my arm and said she'd never speak to me again if I didn't take it. And so I said yes. And that's kind of, as I started looking back over my life, I said yes. So to start tonight, I want to say thank you so much to Tom Hagen. I'm so disappointed I haven't met you that personally, but I hope on one of our many trips back to Erie, I will be able to do so. And to Ferky for his wonderful work running this institution, and to Ben Spagan, who's kind of been the chauffeur that's gotten me through all of this. And then finally, of course, to Chris Reel, without whose efforts I probably would not have been here. Being raised in Erie, I came back here for part of my education, and now you've given me the opportunity to reflect on my life's journey. So I've divided my talk into 3 sections. I'm going to talk about family. I'm going to talk about career development, how you get to be where you are. And then finally, I'm going to reflect a little bit on medical practice and adventures. And those will be the most fun, I think. And I managed to hit the wrong button already. So what did saying yes ever do for me? Well, I think the first thing is that saying yes actually took me to all 7 continents of the United States. It allowed me to sail on all of the oceans that you see listed there, and I can go into details if you want to for the question and answers. I've transited the Pacific, the Atlantic, done numerous sails in the other places. But probably the most important thing was education, that I learned the value of curiosity early, that curiosity leads you to knowledge. And if you have knowledge, you need to use critical thinking. As the Confucians say, knowledge without thought is labor lost. Thought without knowledge is useless. And it was both the sense of adventure and my love of education that led me to the professions that I've had in life. And I'm not going to even talk about my historian, storyteller history since I retired from surgery, but that's where I am today. So why am I here really? Well, I'm really here because of Chris Reel. And here's the promised picture. I'm on the left and Chris is next to me, and we can't quite remember who exactly the other 2 girls are, but I'm sure somewhere in my mother's copious notes there is a reckoning of who that is. And the other big yes in my life led me to my marriage to my wonderful wife, Carolyn Becker, which will come later in the story. But those are 2 of the big yeses. And then finally, the yes that I accepted this opportunity to speak with you tonight with the Jefferson Society. As mentioned, our parents were lifelong friends. My father and Virginia were high school sweethearts. Bud and my dad went back to their own cradle together days. And she told you a little bit about their life together. But one of the other reasons I'm here is because of my amazing 3 brothers who are also here with me today. I'm proud to say. So I will be speaking a little bit about them. My brother Doug, who worked at the end of his career for more than 20 years with USAID. My brother Robert, who worked for the State Department, and my brother Skip, who was both a distinguished attorney and ultimately a federal magistrate judge. My parents went to Strong Vincent High School, as you heard, as did I. And I was more aware of that than I could imagine on my first day as a freshman when I go into the library to be introduced and the librarian says, "Are you Bill Arbuckle's daughter?" And I'm like, "Yes." She said, "Well, I hope you're not liking your parents. They used to neck in the library stacks." I must say that I misbehaved like my parents, but I didn't misbehave in any way that got caught. I had the great privilege of knowing both my grandparents and my great-grandparents, and I loved spending time with them, hearing their Erie stories, and running to them when I was in trouble. When I returned to Erie as a plastic surgery resident in 1977, my father's parents, Grandma and Grandpa Arbuckle, were still alive, living at 531 Vermont Avenue. And I was able to have many, many wonderful dinners with them during that 6 months' time. But and here we are at my parents' 50th wedding anniversary in 1995, with many of our then living in Erie relatives. Sadly, today, none of them are alive living in Erie. But again, thrilled to have my brothers here, and we've been thrilled to be coming back to Erie regularly, even if it's only to visit the tombstones and to reminisce. So why did our family come to Erie? And I think this is really an important story of immigration in this country. People in the early days came to the United States because they were either prosecuted or persecuted. So the Arbuckles came, 7 different brothers over a period of about 15 years between 1690 and 1710, because they were professional horse thieves and they had an option. We can hang you or you can leave. Obviously smart people, they left. On my mother's side, the Millses were Scotch-Irish who migrated first from Scotland and then to Ireland, and not until they got to the United States before the Civil War did they find a home for their religious practices. The Douglases were also Scottish and came at about the same time as the Civil War. And the Cardos were French Huguenots who fled religious persecution. And I like to say that while our relatives were prosecuted or persecuted, we've all learned the value of protest. And we'll go into some of that later. Well, the other part of this story, as I was thinking about it, is I left Erie when I was 17 years old. And it wasn't until I started thinking about this story today that I realized you can leave Erie, but it never leaves you. So I was born at St. Vincent's Hospital. I did a lot of medical work as a medical technologist at St. Vincent's through high school and through part of my college training years. And really had a love of medicine, but really not an idea that I wanted to go into medicine. I came back to Erie when I married my then husband, Dennis Petro. He was one of my classmates in medical school, and I actually wore the same wedding dress for my first wedding as Chris Reel wore for her first wedding. I came back to Erie to do part of my plastic surgery residency in 1977 at Hammett Hospital. And was really grateful for all the things I learned there. And hopefully Ferkie's going to ask me about sexual discrimination later. And then finally, I realized you can't even get away from Erie. My wife and I downsized recently. We sold our Victorian home on one side of Jamaica Pond and moved to a condominium on the other side of Jamaica Pond. When we said we're leaving to cross the pond, people thought we were going to England. But we moved about half a mile away. And immediately met the next door neighbors, and we're talking, where are you from? And I said, I'm from Erie, Pennsylvania. Oh, do you know Lynn McBride? She's my best friend. So Erie is wherever you are. We were a pretty typical family. Here we were with the 3 kids in the mid-50s, and here we are in 1966. All of a sudden, there's a new young brother. Well, this is pretty embarrassing to be a high school student and have your mother suddenly produce another child. But there were a number of us in the class whose mothers did the same thing, so it wasn't completely embarrassing. And it wasn't really until 1974 that we started to be an atypical Erie family. My brother Doug came back from Africa with his lovely wife, Zodi, who became an incredibly integral part of our family, taking care of all of us for all these years. And in fact, they just celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary. The only wedding in the family that lasted longer than my parents. So how did Doug get an Ethiopian wife in Erie, Pennsylvania? Well, you don't. So he graduated from college and entered the Peace Corps. And as part of his experience in the Peace Corps, he was sent to Ethiopia, where he participated in the final smallpox eradication in the world. This was the last epicenter of smallpox in the world. And here he is doing vaccinations in northern Ethiopia. And we are all so grateful that he met Zodi. And then over the years, he returned to work for various aid agencies until he ended up working for USAID for most of his career. And it wasn't really a very easy career. He worked often in Ethiopia, but also in Zambia and Kenya, which were lovely places to work. But he also worked in Iraq during the Iraq War and worked in Sudan during that civil war. So he also worked in lots of places we couldn't visit him. My brother Skip was not so far flung. He went to Grove City College, he went to law school in Ohio, but he's had a very distinguished legal career. He has been a public defender, he's worked for legal aid, he's been in private practice, he has been in politics, and finally he has recently retired as a federal magistrate judge. And we're all really proud of him. And we've showed up for each other over the years. So here I am with with my brother Robert and his husband Hazem, when Skip, I get them all confused. When Skip was being inaugurated as a federal judge, we all went to Williamsport for the ceremony. Robert had a very different career. He actually went to the University of Pennsylvania, the only one of us who went to an Ivy League school. It took him 8 years to get through school because he was working part-time in the museum there as a art historian, I suppose, and never quite understood all of that. And then he came to New York, where I was living, stayed with us and helped me with childcare, and also went to work for the New York Philharmonic. He worked for them for about 6 weeks when Leonard Bernstein walked through and looked at him and said, "Would you like to come work for me as a personal assistant?" He said yes, and over the 8 years that he worked with Leonard Bernstein, he was at the fall of the Berlin Wall. He started a music festival in Japan. I can't even begin to say all of the wonderful things that he did. And it wasn't until Leonard died and he then spent a couple of years in the music industry and realized he didn't want to keep doing funerals, that he joined the State Department. And most of his areas of expertise were in the Middle East and even in Ghana on one occasion. In fact, when he was in Oman, I was teaching and running a hospital in Dubai, and it was his presence in Oman that kept me there because it was really not an easy experience. So for me, family's obviously been important, and I've had a fairly convoluted way of creating my family. I got married to one of my fellow medical students in 1969. We were very blessed to have our son Noah in 1978. We got divorced shortly after that, and it was my great luck that I met Carolyn, and we've been together now for 38 years. And that little boy has grown up to be the director of lunar research for NASA. And I'm sorry he can't be here today, but he's very busy with his kids, taking them to soccer and basketball and swimming and music lessons, even though he's currently laid off from the federal government. So back to saying yes, that's the whole family thing. So my first big yes was about sailing. So I'm about 14 years old, and I'm down at the Erie Yacht Club, and I've been sailing for a while, and this older guy comes up to me and said, "Do you know how to use the trapeze?" And I looked up at him and he said, "Sure." No idea what he was thinking, what he was asking about. So he showed me the boat, and he was racing a little boat called a Fireball, and the crew had to set out with this rig up to the top of the mast, leaning out of the boat to keep the boat level. And you can see a little bit of that here. And I also raced thistles, and I raced a bunch of other small boats. And by the time I was a high school senior, I thought, I think I want to keep sailing. So I heard that there was this college in Florida called the Tritons that had a sailing team. So I decided I would go to Eckerd College, which was then Florida Presbyterian College. Here I am arriving as a freshman, and although at that time I didn't know I was a surgeon, I'd actually made the dress that I'm wearing in that. And 4 years later, as I'm graduating with my then boyfriend, I also made that dress, and we clearly both thought we were going to go somewhere. I have no idea why we decided to have our senior picture taken in a freight car. But the key figure here in my life was my lab partner, Jim Moore. Jim Moore was a very Southern gentleman, a very good scientist. We were both doing pretty complicated biochemical research in our lab, and he turned to me and he said, "Well, I've got my applications into medical school." And I said, "Oh, that's great, congratulations." He said, "It's a good thing you don't want to go to medical school." And I said, "What do you mean I don't want to go to medical school?" He says, "Well, you don't want to go to medical school, do you?" I said, "No, I'm going to be an intellectual." And he said, "Well, that's a good thing because girls can't be doctors." And I looked at him, "What?" And he said, "Well, you wouldn't get in if you tried." And I said, "Well, I can't afford to apply to medical school and graduate school, but if you pay for one medical college application, I'll try." So he took me up on it. And I applied to Hershey for medical school. I got accepted. I got accepted before he got accepted, although he did. So off I go then to Hershey, to Penn State Medical Center. Now my class, the entire college of Eckerd College, was smaller than the freshman class or my senior class at Strong Vincent. When I went to the Hershey Medical Center, that class was smaller than the average class size at a large lecture because they had 30 students in the first class, and I was in the second class. We had 40 students in our class, so it was a really, really small college. And in fact, here's the college as it appeared when I graduated, but it was only half finished when I started. And when we went back for our 50th reunion, here's the college now. It's become this massive medical complex of which we're all quite proud. So what does this have to do with sailing? Well, sailing played a really important role in all of these transitions. As I mentioned, I raced small boats at the beginning of college, but by the end of college, I was actually doing racing with several people on their much larger sailboats as part of the Southern Ocean Racing Conference. So I go off to medical school, and I continue to fly down to Florida on weekends to do these sailboat races. And I get called into the office by the chairman of microbiology, Fred Rapp at the time, and he says to me, "I'm very worried about you. You're missing classes, and I'm not sure you're serious about being a doctor. What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, Dr. Rapp, I'm actually racing sailboats." And he said, "You know how to sail?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Will you teach me how to sail, please?" So I actually gave up flying to Florida and spent weekends on the Chesapeake teaching Fred Rapp how to sail. That paid off in spades a year later when I started taking an animal husbandry research course with this guy named Max Lang. So I took this one semester course. We each were given 7 animals. We were given a whole group of different kinds of operations we had to do on those animals. We had to learn how to do the anesthesia, the surgery, the post-op care. And out of the 8 kids in the class, I was the only one. All the animals survived. So I'm feeling really good. You know, I've knocked it out of the park, and I flunked. Well, what do you do when you flunk a course you don't think is just? You go to the admissions, you go to the promotions committee, and you say, "This isn't fair." Well, chairman of the promotions committee was Fred Rapp. And Fred says to Max, "Why did you flunk her?" And Max says, "Girls can't be surgeons." I passed. And in fact, in later years, I went on to do a fair amount of surgery for friends of mine who were dog breeders, correcting various problems with their dogs, even though it wasn't my primary career. And every time I did one of these things, I thought about Max Lang, screw you. So I'm going to go on now to some of my medical career, and I want to assure you that I'm not going to show you pictures of leeches, because I used leeches quite a bit in my early microsurgery practice. It was a medical management of venous congestion. I'm not going to show you any pictures of maggots because those are really disgusting, but maggots are actually a really efficient way to debride wounds, and people coming into the hospital who have maggot-infested wounds are often surprisingly healthy because of that. I'm not going to show you anything about hyperbaric chambers because I ran several hyperbaric chambers where we treated carbon monoxide poisoning, gas gangrene, and a variety of other things. And I'm not going to show you pictures of poisonous snakes because I was the head of the venom research lab at the Bronx Zoo for several years. I'm definitely not going to show you open wounds, at least not yet. I'm not going to show you graphic pictures of surgery, and I'm not going to show you any pictures of serious medical conditions, so there's not going to be too many times when you're going to have to look away, except for occasional medical conditions like this Kaposi sarcoma in a young AIDS patient. But I go ahead, and now I'm going to go back a little bit. So I graduated from medical school. I went to Louisville, Kentucky, where I was an intern rotating through all the different specialties. And on my surgery rotation, I got called to the ER one day for a young man who had fallen off a roof into a vat of roofing tar. So they brought him in, a very nice young man, looking perfectly healthy. I called my attending, and he said, "Oh, that's terrible. He's going to die." And I said, "Why is he going to die?" And he said, "Oh, this is a wound that we can't treat. There's nothing you're going to be able to do." Well, it didn't seem that was reasonable, so I went right to the library, as a good scholar does, and started looking through the literature. And I found this guy in Columbia University who was talking about a new topical burn agent that seemed to have miraculous properties for healing. It was called Silvadene. At the time, it wasn't commercially available like it is today. So I called this guy, Charlie Fox, and I talked to him about the patient, and he sent me about 2.5 pounds of this powdered stuff and taught me how to compound it so I could make it into the cream and apply it. And about 3 weeks later, I called my attending and said, "We're ready for skin grafting." He's like, "Who's ready for skin grafting?" I said, "The guy that fell into the vat of tar." And he said, "What?" When we got this guy grafted and out of the hospital, I thought, this is fascinating. Nobody wants to take care of burn patients. What a great opportunity to do something that's really intriguing, and nobody else seems to be very interested in it. And Charlie will appear later, but I also found that as a young woman in the field, you often are asked to do things that nobody else wants to do. So an example of this is 1977 when I'm doing my plastic surgery residency. I'm a first-year resident. I've already finished my general surgery. I'd practiced private. I'd been in general surgery practice for a year, and I went back to Hershey. And they call me one day and they say, "There's some guy here from the National Endowment for the Humanities that wants to take pictures of doctors using their hands. Will you do it?" I said, "Sure, absolutely, yes." I only found out later that they'd asked about 10 people, and they all said, no, I don't want to do it. Let Jane do it. So this young guy shows up. He's a photographer, and I found out that Eric Avery is, in fact, a physician. He was a practicing psychiatrist who was also an artist. I show this picture of Eric rather than him because this is his own self-portrait, the portrait of the doctor as a young artist. And we had nothing to do that day, but I met him in the coffee room, and we're sitting there chatting. I get a call to the ER, and this guy had just come into the ER with an amputated hand from an axe, which gives you a nice, clean amputation. So I talked to the patient, I talked to Eric, and the patient gave us permission to photograph this process. We take him to the OR, and here I am with my attendings as a team reattaching this hand, and it worked really well. And Eric stayed for several days so he could take all the post-op photos, and we became very, very good friends. And in fact, over the years, he and I have done numerous projects together. One of the more interesting ones was our HIV political action later in the mid-'80s. Eric printed out these enormous wallpapers of the blood smear, the normal blood smear, and then he made these piñatas of HIV molecules that were stuffed with condoms. And we would set this up into a clinic in New York City. We did it in Minnesota. We did it in Baltimore. And we would open the door for HIV testing to anybody who wanted to come in and get tested for HIV. This is when it was first testable, but nobody really wanted to know. And my role was actually just pretty straightforward. I would draw the bloods and talk with the patient and give them their pre and post counseling. And we took this then a step further in our later work, working for open clinics, making medicine available for everybody. We would set up clinics at hospitals, and we would set up clinics in art museums. And we would put out an open call, and I would practice medicine. I would do driver's license physical exams. I would do HIV counseling. I would examine all kinds of things with an audience and with Eric sort of narrating the process of medical care. But again, I'm going back and forth a little bit. So when I finished my plastic surgery residency in Pennsylvania, I wanted to do burns, and I decided that I would go to the Jacobi Hospital Burn Center to practice. And it was actually Charlie Fox, my old friend from the original Silvadene, who arranged for me to get this very coveted fellowship. And I was also interested in continuing to do the microsurgery, so I did a fellowship in burns and in microsurgery at Montefiore, and then went on to be an attending in Jacobi Hospital and to continue to do microsurgery at Montefiore, which meant I was basically doing two jobs on a salary that was about half what any of my other associates were making. When I discovered the salary discrepancy, I went to my chairman and I said, I'd like to get paid more. And he said, well, we just can't afford it. So I said, fine. And Lou Del Gurcio called me from Westchester and said, we're starting a new burn center. Will you come up and start it? Well, it turns out Lou was really good friends with Charlie. Charlie had called him. So Lou hired me to start the new burn center at the Westchester Medical Center. So this was really my first really major academic performance. And I loved working in the burn center. When you're working with the burn team, it is a team. The doctor is not in charge. The doctor is part of the team. The nurses, the physical therapists, the nutritionists, the dietitians, everybody tells you what to do, and you agree with it, and you go ahead and you do it. So it was great training for the rest of my career to be working there. And our first burn fellow that year was this kid who was brought up from Brazil to be the burn center in our brand new Westchester Medical Center Burn Center. Lovely kid, he shows up, he's 19, and he graduated from medical school that year. And I'm thinking, why is he doing a burn fellowship? What's the story here? Well, of course, it turns out Charlie Fox was best friends with his father, and his father ran the only burn center in South America, in Goiânia, Brazil. So Nelson had been working with his dad long before he even went to medical school. We had a fabulous collaboration together, and over the years, the burn center in Brazil would treat 500 to 1,000 patients a month. The busiest burn center in the United States rarely exceeds 500, and occasionally some of them will get up to 700 or 800 patients a month. So if we had anything that we needed to test on a patient, going to Goiânia was the natural way to do it. Nelson went on to then complete general surgery residency, trained in plastic surgery in Brazil with the great Ivo Bitangue that I got to meet several times and work with. Nelson went on to be president of the International Burn Association, the International Plastic Surgery Association, and we've done a lot of traveling together. But the happiest story in my life came in 1987. I had come out to myself in 82 as a gay woman, very closeted. I certainly didn't want anybody to know, not professionally at least, but I joined a group called the Women in Medicines Organization that would have an annual conference, multidisciplinary medical conference. We could get CME for it. And the group was also known as the Dyke Docs. So I go to the Dyke Docks meeting in 1987, and they have a pre-canoe trip on the Boundary Waters. So I'm going on the canoe trip, and I have to go back and say that my mother raised us on South Pacific. So I grew up believing some enchanted evening you will meet a stranger. And the rest is true, and there she was. And now to get out of the family and some of the introduction, what did I actually do and how did I get to do it? Well, over the years, I worked for a number of government agencies, USAID through Doug, the State Department through SCIP, and Dubai Healthcare City from a variety of fairly complicated reasons that I won't go into. I had personal connections with all of my fellows. After Nelson was such a stupendous success in 1981 as our first burn fellow, I took an international burn fellow every year for 25 years. So I had connections all over the world with people that I had trained and taught, and a variety of organizations that I worked with and I worked for. I worked with nonprofit organizations. The two most frequently was the Healing the Children Foundation and the Palestinian Children's Relief Fund. I also did education, teaching, and research in all of these countries. And also, interestingly enough, as someone who's pretty much an atheist, I did a lot of work with a variety of religious organizations, including the Catholic Relief Fund, a very fundamentalist Baptist series of congregations in southern Westchester, the ultra-Orthodox organization that's run by Bechir Cholim in the New York metropolitan area, and the Jehovah's Witnesses. For all of these other groups, I actually agreed to take Medicaid. So they were very happy that I was agreeing to do that. With the Jehovah's Witnesses, I agreed that if they didn't want transfused, I'd be happy not to do it. So in 1987, when I came out, and then I also was one of the public speakers at the first AIDS protest in Washington. This is the quilts that were shown at in Washington. And I appeared on television speaking about AIDS and how non-discrimination was important. And some of the people would ask me if I was a gay woman, and I said yes. I thought, well, there goes the religious organizations for sure. I saw one of the Black Baptist preachers not too long after returning who said, "Oh, I saw you on TV. Congratulations. We're so proud of what you're doing." Bechir Cholim the following year gave me their public service award, and the Jehovah's Witnesses kept coming. So it didn't have any negative impact on my practice at all. I'm going to briefly go through a couple of the international trips that I took, again related to some of the religious organizations. Doug was in Zambia at the time, so I went down to Zambia taking all my tools and toys and everything, thinking that I'm going to be teaching at the university hospital. While we're en route to Zambia, there was a riot, and the government shut down the public hospital because the medical students were protesting some government policy that was impacting patient care. So I get there and the university hospital is closed. The students have all been disbanded. So Doug arranged for me to go work with the Sisters of Charity, the Mother Teresa's group, in rural Zambia. So I arrive, and a very interesting scene. All these older women with all these young children, and of course everybody gets dressed up to go to the doctor in Africa. But I saw these young kids with very advanced tuberculosis. This is scrofula. I saw scabies on all of these people. And as I'm working with these nuns, these were three sisters who had been trained by Mother Teresa. One was from Romania, one was from Italy, and one was from India. They didn't speak the same language, and they had 3 months of medical training, and they were sent to this rural community with tiny packets of medication to hand out. Well, I'm not a genius, but I know that you don't give minor doses of drugs to things like tuberculosis or scabies, and there was no medicine for HIV at the time. They were basically creating a soup bowl of multi-drug resistant conditions there. So I actually left and went back and had a good time. I left my son with my brother's family while we were visiting there, and he was happy to have me back, and we had a great trip to Victoria Falls, as I recall. Then I went to Antarctica. The following year, it was Noah's turn to pick a trip, and he wanted to go to the Antarctic. So we went to the Antarctic, a beautiful, beautiful place, and this was going to be a vacation. So I arrived to pick up the boat to go in the Falkland Islands, and there's a friend of mine who's a breast surgeon that I know well. So he's already mad at me because I know somebody on the trip. And we had this beautiful time traveling Antarctica, but sadly, I ended up also having to work. One of the crewmen got appendicitis. There were 12 doctors on the boat, 9 of whom were retired radiologists. And three of us who were all surgeons. So we drew straws, and I got to be the anesthesiologist. The breast surgeon, as a woman, of course, got to draw the nurse's straw. And the pulmonary transplant surgeon got to do the appendectomy. And it was quite a scene. I mean, there was no regulation there. We went to a Chilean Air Force base that said they had a really good operating room. It was a little trailer. It was a tiny room. And like everybody in that town wanted to come and watch us operate. But I can report that the patient did well. He was waiting table 2 days later. Pride goes before the fall. And I, like many surgeons, I will admit to having had a fair amount of arrogance. And my brother had told me that there was this beautiful fistula hospital treating obstetrical fistulas in Ethiopia. And I thought, well, I can do all these great flaps, and I've closed holes of all kinds in the past, so I'm going to go and see what I can do for them. Well, it was like a non sequitur for me. Catherine Hamlin had started this in the 1960s with her husband. Rectal vaginal fistulas occur, and vesical vaginal fistulas occur after traumatic childbirth. And when you have that kind of a traumatic childbirth, the child is going to die, and the mother is going to be left leaking feces and urine. So these women were ostracized from their families. They were incontinent and they were unclean. And basically, they were often moved into a hut where they were starved to death. Catherine and her husband started recognizing this and began to develop a program of treatment. And their treatment, just like on our burn center, was comprehensive. They'd bring the patients into their facility where they would rehabilitate them with nutrition, infection control, physical therapy, and they also offered education. So by the time I get there, and she'd already been running this hospital for, 30 years, they had a huge, beautiful compound. And the entire compound was run by former patients who not only were taking care of other patients, they were actually also trained to do the surgery. And I think that's something that's not widely recognized is you can teach anybody to do one operation. And so she had all these former patients doing it. They didn't need my expertise at all, but I learned, number one, about humility, and number two, a tremendous amount about healthcare with limited resources. Let me just go back if I can to that. So today there are 35 fistula hospitals throughout Africa involving 9 nations, and there's 150 local hospitals. And this is still one of the most significant women's health issues in the world today. And it's in spite of Catherine Hamlin's work and all of her work, this is still a largely unattended issue. But what Catherine did was teach us how women can take care of women. Another trip to Ethiopia in 2004, Carolyn and I went together, and we did a big trip with my brother and his family and my family. But we saw a tremendous amount of polio, blindness from the tsetse flies, and goiter. And when we got home and I started looking at my slides, and Carolyn and I were talking about why do we have all this iodine deficiency? We also saw congenital iodine deficiency. Here you have what's called cretinism, where the infant is born with iodine deficiency that leaves them with about a 30 to 40 point on average lower IQ. So iodine deficiency leads to hypothyroidism, which is a really major health problem. So what I discovered was that iodine deficiency had been endemic in Ethiopia forever. They have a diet that has no sea access, so their primary dietary sources lack iodine. And in 1974, the communist regime had overthrown Haile Selassie. And one of the first things they did is stop the importation of salt because someone in their group thought that iodine in the salt was a birth control. And this was a Western plot to create more infertility in Africa. And then, of course, they had a famine, and by 1991, the Derg was overthrown. So what Carolyn and I did, we came home and we wrote an article in the Endocrine News using my photographs and her intelligence and connections, and we connected the USAID group with the International Iodine Global Network and began reintroducing iodized salt into Ethiopia. It's not completely cleared today, but I think that's significantly better. Doug is nodding, yes. So the other kind of group that I worked with was in South America with healing the children. A cleft lip is endemic in South America for a really interesting reason. The native populations in South America, in both Central and South America, believed that the cleft lip was a kiss of the gods. So if you were born with a cleft lip, you were taken in by the religious authorities and the ruling families, and you were raised to be one of the members of the elite. Well, it is a congenital defect. So this led to, over time, a incidence of cleft lip in the population of about 1 in 40 live births. If you look in contrast to that, China, cleft lip was considered to be a curse, and those children were drowned or terminated in some fashion for over 6,000 years. So the incidence in China is less than 1 in 14,000 live births. So there's lots of opportunity to do cleft lip repairs in South America, and I put together a team, and we started going regularly to a hospital in Santa Marta. Now, one of the things I believe is that you don't go to one place and do one operation and go away. So I always wanted to put together a program that would involve repeated visits over time so that we could train local staff to do it and also do follow-up on the patients. This was a beautiful, huge municipal hospital. And it takes a real team to do this. The local officials, usually one of the local ladies' associations or one of the local religious organizations, would go out and find the patients for us. So we would arrive on day one, and there'd be about 400 patients waiting to be seen. Some of us who were going to be doing the surgeries would screen the patients. We brought our own nurses. We brought our own anesthesiologists. I usually traveled with at least one plumber and an electrician. We brought all our own equipment, all our own anesthesia equipment, all of our own surgery equipment, and all of the drugs that we could possibly smuggle into the country. And these hospitals, although they were beautiful, they were really clean. They had nothing. Have you ever been in a hospital in the United States that has a corridor that looks like this? There's always carts in the hall. There's things, it's always congested and crowded. This was more typical of them. So these are some of the cases that we were able to see and take care of. This is my nurse, Jane, on the far right. Jane was my nurse from the day I started at the burn center until the day I retired in 2009. She was my right arm. We operated together, and she went with me on all these trips. The other woman holding the child is one of my colleagues, Laura Sadarsky, and here's one of the children we've just operated on, showing that his palate has been repaired. We didn't only do the cleft lips. Something simple like a duplicated thumb is just a very simple procedure to do in the United States, but if you have no resources and no money, you're not going to get any care at all in a country like Colombia. And this young girl had this chronic open wound, probably from some kind of a scorpion bite that had been there for several months, and we were able to close it. And this is my friend Marie. Marie was a resident at Jacobi when I was at the burn center. She went on to become an ENT surgeon, and it was only as I started doing my research a couple years ago about women who were firsts that Marie found out she was the first Black woman to be board certified in ENT, but she got board certified without knowing what a groundbreaker was. And she and I and Jane went everywhere. Here's Jane looking really really irritated because we haven't finished the schedule yet. On the other hand, she's really happy because we're not losing any instruments. There's Marie with one of our kids, and here's Jane again. She would often walk through the halls with some kind of a witch doctor doll trying to get away the bad spirits. And the team went with me always. I mean, we usually traveled with as many as 30 people to do these trips. And I went to Santa Marta probably 20 times. I went to Ghana with my brother Robert in 2001, primarily because they were starting a new burn center. So I go and I'm talking with the doctors and the nurses who are going to be running the burn center about modern techniques and things. And of course, it turns out that burn center was funded by Charlie Fox. Yeah. So he followed me through my whole career. So I have led a life of activism. In college, I was active in the anti-Vietnam War movement and also active in the civil rights movement. When I got to St. Petersburg, Florida in 1964, they still had colored entrances and segregated churches and segregated buses. Not so when I left in 68, not because of me, but because of other obvious changes in the world. In medical school, I worked on reproductive health, and I also worked on movements for healthcare for all. We started opening and running free clinics in Harrisburg, Lancaster, and other areas. And as a resident, one of my first major papers was a paper on domestic violence in women. I started seeing these women in the emergency room who would tell me these really weird stories about how they got hurt and, it never fit. I talked to some other friends of mine who said, well, it sounds like it could be a domestic violence. So I published a paper reviewing 20 women that I was able to identify actually were victims of domestic violence. And it was the first article in the literature about adult domestic violence. The only one before that had been about child abuse. I also worked in immigrant rights. We did physical exams for people seeking asylum that would actually involve identifying the scars of torture, typical physical findings related to torture, or for many women, the scars related to congenital or to genital mutilation. And then coming up to the present time, we've continued to be activists on reproductive rights, which again is a major issue in the healthcare world, and anti-war. So when I retired in 2009, my staff met me as I walked out of the ER with a fuselage of liposuction cannulas. And I drove to Boston, where Carolyn and I got married, because now that I was retired, I needed health insurance. So it sounds like I maybe had time for everything in my life. I didn't really, but I made it work. I had Noah, of course. We started our family. I was a single mother. I taught Noah how to love sailing and how to sail. And then, of course, Carolyn and I raised him from the age of 8 on. And he's a very successful scientist today, the head of lunar research for NASA, although he's laid off, as I said, right now, and his wife and his 3 beautiful children. And here's our family yesterday, having our picture taken in the lobby of the hotel. My brother Doug and his wife Zodi, Carolyn, and then Robert, and our cousin John, who's been with us through many of these adventures, and myself and my brother Skip. And I can't thank them enough for being here today, and I can't thank them enough for all the things they've done to me, or to me, for me. Excuse me. I couldn't possibly have meant that. So what's a person to do in retirement? Well, it's not over until it's over. So I've continued to sail. Carolyn and I are both avid gardeners. We've done lots of traveling, spending time with family and friends, and just a little activism, as one should. So thank you for listening, and may you all go and make good trouble.
How about another round of applause for Dr. Petro, Erie's own? So folks, I'll remind you, those in the audience with us, our team is going around. When you came in, they might have given you an index card and a golf pencil. We are taking questions from you, the audience, and we're going to get through as many as we can. Again, good penmanship, please. I'll be trying to read those. If you didn't get an index card, just raise your hand. One of our helpful team members will come to you to bring one. They'll also collect your questions. They'll bring them up to me. Dr. Petro, one of the things that I appreciated about that was that so many accomplishments, and I want to get to some of them, but one line stuck with me is that you can leave Erie, but Erie never leaves you. Here we are in your hometown, Erie, Pennsylvania, and I can't help but think of a story that you were telling me when we first connected about a trip back to Erie. You were doing some training. You were driving around with a family member. We met many of them on stage tonight here on this screen. You're driving around with your grandfather. You were headed out to the peninsula, which many of us do, drive around, love Presque Isle. But the car stops. You pull over. He gets out. Take us to that story.
So yeah, my grandfather loved to go around the peninsula. So I picked him up and we're driving out 8th Street in, what was the name of it? There was a big motel as your way out. There was a conference center, and there was a big Planned Parenthood's conference being held there. The Bel Air, that's it. Yes, thank you. So my grandfather says, stop, you've got to stop, pull over. Okay, I think, what's he going to do? He gets out, and there was all these people out there protesting the Planned Parenthood. And my grandfather gets out, and he's waving his cane. You should leave them alone. They're doing good work. We need Planned Parenthood. And I had never known that they were actually reproductive rights, but my grandfather and grandmother were both big advocates and contributors to Planned Parenthood.
And you're active today in activism and protest. We talked about prosecuted, persecuted, and protest. What impact did that moment have on your journey, your trajectory as somebody that's still active today, somebody that still protests today, somebody that gets in some good trouble today?
Well, I think that to me justified my own activism and my own interest in protesting. If any of you have gone to any of the No King's Day protests or shown up for any of the ICE protests, who's there? It's us. I'd say the average age of the protesters is probably 65 and up. There's a few young people. But if we don't speak up, who will? So I think it's still critical to think carefully about what's happening around us and to try to make sure that we're shaping a world that we're going to allow our grandchildren to live in, whether it's climate activism, reproductive health, immigrants.
So to that end, taking note of the age of protesters, for those that say, I'm exhausted, I'm tired, why am I still decades later protesting this? What sort of encouragement do you give them that I think also speaks to young people of don't give up in the moment? Speak your voice, speak out for the things that you value and you hold dear and that are important to you and humanity.
Well, I think the best example of that is the women's rights movement in 1848. Carolyn and I just were in Seneca Falls. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and all those wonderful women met in 1848 to get women the vote. When did we get the vote? 1920. So you have to persist. You can't give up. And eventually right over wrong, I hope, occurs.
And one of the hobbies, so you mentioned retirement, which I think if we can count all of your successes, perhaps that's the only failure I can identify in the bunch, is that you've not given up. But one of the things, aside from sailing, gardening, and spending time with loved ones, you've been doing history, you told me. And part of that was the 1800s and 19th century, and researching female doctors in the 19th century. What drew you to that? What made that attractive? And what have you found that you think would surprise our audience tonight?
Well, I found a lot, but it actually started when I moved to Boston. Carolyn was still working, and I'm the housewife, so I'm walking the dog in Forest Hill Cemetery. And I started coming across these graves of women who were doctors who died in 1882, 1882, 1892. And I thought, I didn't know there were doctors there. Well, we all know about Elizabeth Blackwell, right? I mean, she was only one. By 1900, there were over 9,000 women doctors in the United States. And so I got interested in who were these people and how come we didn't know about them? And in fact, these were wonderful women. And why don't we know about them? Well, because they were women. The first women's hospital was started in Boston in 1857 by Marie Zakrzewska, who was an immigrant. She actually trained in Berlin. She certainly knew about Semmelweis's work. And she brought hand washing to the United States. She actually had heard that Elizabeth Blackwell was a doctor, so she came to New York and found Blackwell. And Blackwell helped her go to medical school. She was the seventh woman to graduate from medical school. She helped Blackwell start her hospital in New York, and then the suffragists and the abolitionists talked her into coming to Boston. She started the first all-women's hospital in Boston in 1862, where it was staffed by women doctors for women and children patients, which was a radical departure at that time. And over the next 10 years, she trained people that went on to start over 14 other women's hospitals in the United States. Again, something we know nothing about today. Well, one of the things that we didn't know about it today is that it ended in 1900. The American Medical Association had really gained a lot of control over medical education. So the homeopathic hospitals, the osteopathic hospitals were only just getting started. But many of the other what they call now non-traditional medical schools were closed, especially all of the women's medical schools. So we didn't have 9,000 women doctors in the United States again until long after I graduated from medical school. And these women they were fascinating people. I love their stories, and I can go on and on about them. But that's what got me. I was in sort of the epicenter of the women in medicine movement and just loved rediscovering their stories.
Is there a book in the works that we might buy in the future? Are there articles that we can read? Where are you headed with this research?
I've been giving lectures about it widely and pretty much targeted. If I'm in Seattle, I'll look up all the early women doctors of Seattle. If I'm in San Francisco, I'll do the same. So I've got probably 30 city-by-city histories of these. I'm not sure that makes a book yet. But I've written multiple articles about this, and actually have a book coming out now about women plastic surgeons. When I finished plastic surgery, I was told I was the 19th woman to get board certified in plastic surgery. As I came up through, I mean, I've looked at it, there were more than 90 before them, but where are they? They either didn't take their boards or various reasons they're forgotten, but many of them continued to work. So that's going to be really fun.
One of the things that you shared in your journey were two different things that I heard audible reaction to from the audience. One is girls don't go to medical school. And then this idea that you, among all of your peers, are the only one to keep all the animals alive, and you fail the class, and you have to contest that. But that wasn't it. There's a third time in which you were doing a residency, or you're unpacking your things, getting set up, and a male supervisor colleague asks, "Are you unpacked yet?" Because he's hoping you're not. Because you told me his job was to make you quit.
That's absolutely true. That was here in Erie. It was Frank Tews, who I think is still alive. He's listed as practicing. Frank said to me, "Oh, I'm going to make you quit." And I said to him, "Frank, I've already been a general surgeon. You're not going to make me quit." And he said, "Watch me." So what he did is he put me on call for all 4 hospitals in Erie every night for 6 months. And I was expected to do all the other things. Well, it was my grandparents that saved my life. When I could finish something, I could run out to 531 Vermont Avenue and have a great dinner with my grandparents. I never told them anything that was going on, but they were like an anchor for me. And Dennis would come up from Hershey from time to time and see me, but I really didn't have time to have much of a social life. And there was one other woman surgeon at Hammett Hospital at that time. She was an orthopedic resident, and so she and I would occasionally have time to have dinner and commiserate. But I can remember many days standing in the sink scrubbing, crying, because I had to go in the operating room and work with this guy.
So, right to an audience question, how did you keep yourself motivated? How did you keep yourself driven? Because I think against those odds, maybe it's just me, but it seems awfully easy to say no and to quit and to give up. What kept you motivated? What was your drive?
I think part of it was, if I quit, then nobody else is going to have a chance. And some of it is I'm just stubborn. Yes.
We're getting some affirmation from the front row, which is largely occupied by families. So I think we know we're hearing the truth. So, but I think there's real power to that, of that that you continue on to show others that it's doable and it's accomplishable. And no doubt we've made progress and we've come a longish way in several decades, but there's still a long way to go. Can you talk about where you see sexism today compared to where you experienced it when you were first getting started? And what advice would you give to women medical professionals in the room, and especially male medical professionals in the room, to lift up others, perhaps like a Charlie Fox has helped you along the way? What guidance do you give?
Well, I think it's really important to be a supporter, to be empathetic and sympathetic. And I would have said, oh, things are so much better. But I've started to work on this book about women plastic surgeons, and my colleagues on it are, one is a chairman of plastic surgery at a major teaching hospital. Another is a full professor at a teaching hospital. The stories they have to tell are exactly the same stories I experienced. And if you look at the numbers, although 60% of medical students are now women, it's less than 10% of major department share. And in many of the surgical specialties, it's far less than that. So getting to the first level is not as hard anymore, but getting to the next levels is much harder. But all along the way, did you notice I didn't have any women mentors? The people that mentored me were the male mentors, the Charlie Foxes and the Lou Del Guercios and numbers of other people. Marie Brown Wagner, my ENT friend, told me that I was her only mentor, that even the men weren't mentoring her at that time. So I think you just have to understand that the battle is still going on. The other thing that is true for women doctors is they're still making 20% or 25% less than male doctors. I mean, I was getting less than a half salary working 2 jobs, and now people are still getting less than a half salary, often working those 2 jobs. The other thing is there's still no real overt support for women who want to have children. So there's a huge infertility problem for women doctors, especially surgeons and anesthesiologists, because the anesthesia gases that inevitably leak into the OR are known to impede fetal development and to also impede ovarian development. So, or the development of the eggs. So you finished your training, you're 33, and now you want to start having a family, but you're also starting a career. And there's really no easy way you can get that placed in. And there's really almost no attempts yet to make that possible. So you've got to squeeze it in. I had Noah as a senior plastic surgery resident, and I had him Thanksgiving Day. The day before Thanksgiving, I did a 10-hour surgery. I then delivered the baby, and I'm in the hospital at Harrisburg Hospital postpartum, and they kept you for a few days then, which was kind of nice. I didn't have to cook Thanksgiving dinner, and I didn't have to. And one of my partners came and said, "Would you mind making rounds for me while you're here?"
No.
And you know how dumb I was? I said yes.
So what do we do? I know that's a huge question to ask you, but of the experience that you've accumulated, the wisdom that you have, and I think calling attention to it at events like tonight's, how do we speak louder? How do we make sure that there's not just a few cracks in the glass ceiling, that more women are getting into leadership positions in the medical field? What would you do if we turn the keys over to you? If there were a magic wand, how do we make more progress? I know a big question, but your experience of saying yes, you're trailblazing, you're getting there. How can we, the audience, do more?
Support your grandchildren, I suppose. Encourage them. I give my granddaughter, she's really into sports, so I give her all the children's books about the sports heroes. And of course, she's considering a career in the National Women's Basketball Association. And if that's her dream, she should go for it. That's a great career. In terms of the barriers, I think being a willing ear to listen when somebody wants to complain about it, but encouraging people to follow their dreams. It's not impossible to follow your dreams. It's just pretty darn tough.
And I think it's a community-wide, not a handout, but a hand up, or support, the support that you got, more support from others. Can we turn to some issues of the day from the audience? There's some news out that there are various outbreaks, measles, etc. We see people turning away from vaccines. Our audience is curious. Your take on those turning toward anti-vaccine measles outbreak. What do you make of the news today when it comes to that?
Well, I think we have a leadership in our country today that's encouraging anti-science thinking. Science is difficult. Science isn't right. Science is a process. So what we know, when I teach in medical students, I teach them, you're going to learn 100 facts today. 50 of them are wrong, and 25% of them are only partially right. And that's because science is a process that gets better and better. So infectious diseases, one of the things I do in the cemeteries, I take pictures of the dead babies' graves. You'll see these cemeteries, and there'll be families that have 4 or 5 or 6 kids that are all dead before age 4. And these are the wealthy families that could afford a tombstone. So you look at infant mortality in our country, and what it dropped in the 1900s from was actually the clean milk laws that started pasteurizing milk, clean water and sewage disposal that made clean water safe and hazardous. And it wasn't only until later when we started getting vaccines that dropped it even more. So public health is a process. Vaccines weren't the miracle. But how many of you had relatives that had polio? Yeah. Have you known anybody with polio today? Well, we're seeing polio again. And in fact, we're seeing polio worldwide again, because this is a persistent organism that comes in the sewage, and if you're playing in dirty water and you aren't vaccinated, you'll get it. The polio vaccine was an enormous breakthrough for public health. Smallpox, how many of you have had smallpox? I mean, the miracle of smallpox is it's probably the only organism that we're going to eradicate, because it's the only infectious disease we know that really basically only infected humans. So having vaccinated a sufficient population to not make it possible for the virus to multiply, we've eliminated it. This seemed like the first of many, many triumphs, but I don't think we have another infectious disease that is that specific. When I was putting together the talk, I talked to Carolyn about iodine pills. How many of you remember taking iodine pills in grade school? And somehow as I'm doing this, I thought, oh, this was good. They were giving us iodine in grade school so we wouldn't get hypothyroid. And Carolyn said, no, they were giving it to us so we wouldn't get iodine, we wouldn't get thyroid disease when the nuclear bombs went off. And she was right. I looked it up. So our ideas about things change. I'm really worried about somebody like Bobby Kennedy, who seems to embrace an it's not so much the things he says against vaccines, it's the things he says against science, so that people are not trusting science. If you're told that your children could have an adverse reaction to vaccines, of course you're going to think about it. And if you say it's only 1 in 100,000, most of us would probably say, well, that's an acceptable risk. But a lot of people would say, oh, no, that's not enough of a risk for me. I'm not going to vaccinate my children. And now we have this measles outbreak. We don't have hundreds of children dying yet, but if this continues and we have an increasing population of unimmunized children, we're going to see deaths from measles. We're going to see deaths from typhus. And do we have infrastructure enough to provide us with clean drinking water? There's an enormous problem with clean drinking water in this country today. We need to have the infrastructure that restores the water supply to towns. I see one of your former winners was the wonderful pediatric surgeon from Detroit. Carolyn, what was her name? Mona Atiyah.
Oh, one of our previous guests here at the Global Summit, actually part of a Gannon Reads program, partnership with Gannon University. Mona Tisha wrote the book about the Flint, Michigan water crisis.
Yeah. I mean, here's a genius woman. She's sitting in a public health service and she sees this issue and she figures out that there's lead in the water and she figures out why there's lead in the water. And then she raises holy hell and they stopped letting lead be in the water, although it took 10 more years and lots of litigation and lots of harassment. And there's still lots of towns that have lead in the water. Boston still has leaded water pipes going into homes. So it's not a solution, but you've recognized a problem and it raised the way of beginning to correct it.
Maybe it's persistence, and it is the research and the proof of evidence. I'm thinking about your reaction to the patient that fell into the bucket of tar and just written off, and yet into the library you head, the research you do, picking up the phone, calling another doctor, finding a solution, and then coming back and saying, we're ready to try something. How do we get that confidence back when we say, here are researchers, here are professionals, here's how science works. How do we do that better today?
We have people doing that all over the place. You've got them in the CDC. We had them in USAID, identifying epidemic diseases that were emerging in Africa, and they've eliminated USAID. We have them in the CDC, and they've just fired 4,000 CDC workers, even though they had to hire a bunch of them back. This is all part of the process. Curiosity, dedication, and just it's really about curiosity. What makes something happen? Well, how can you make it better? And this is something that you learn in school, that you get educated for.
I want to go back a little bit into your history. You had mentioned in one of your slides that an activist for with the Vietnam War, anti-war initiatives. We were just talking about one of the experiences that you had as a plastic surgeon addressing the person with the roofing tar. One of the questions from the audience starts off first with congratulations. It's thank you for all you've done. Then it says, I medevaced 29 Marines in Vietnam. Can you talk briefly about napalm burns? Any experience with that?
Fortunately, I didn't have any experience with them, although Carolyn and I went to Vietnam and Cambodia, about 10 years ago. And, there's such a thing as inherited trauma. We know about epigenetics, that a whole population experiencing something like went on in Vietnam has to be traumatized. And we not only napalmed these people, we dropped Agent Orange, which creates enormous birth defects and cancers and other harm, not just to the vegetation that they were trying to wipe out, but also to the population. And our guides, they were terrific. They were very welcoming. Americans are very welcome there. The guides talked to oh yeah, that was the war. We've forgotten all about it. Well, we got to Saigon and we decided we didn't want to go on some of the other tours. So we went to the Modern Art Museum in Saigon. And that's where we saw what the Vietnamese people thought about the war. You saw more anti-war paintings. And the most striking one I recall is a wall-to-wall, floor-to-ceiling, bright orange background depicting all the different kinds of birth defects that they had seen from the Agent Orange. So they hadn't really forgotten it. They're just trying to hide it. And it's our job not to forget. It's our job not to hide these things and try not to do this again.
And so I want to speed forward a little bit forward in your history and look at the 80s. You talked about your work around HIV positive and AIDS, and you were part of the only hospital at that time that was accepting HIV positive patients. What did that mean to you to be on the front lines working on that and then working with patients that were otherwise being turned away, ostracized, and pushed out from other hospitals, yet to be a beacon that's receiving that and working on that? What did that mean to you in the 80s?
Well, first of all, I was the only one in my hospital, but I wasn't the only one in the New York metropolitan area. I had lots of colleagues in Manhattan that were working in the hospitals that were inundated with patients. For me personally, how could you say no? These were people with enormous suffering and enormous problems, and we didn't have a solution. The least we could do is have compassion and kindness for them. So what happened to me is I gave up my career at that moment in plastic surgery. I continued to do emergency call. I continued to work in the burn unit, but I became a general surgeon again. So when patients came in that had acute thoracic or abdominal emergencies and they were HIV positive, no one else would operate on them. So I took care of them. It wasn't even a question. It was an obligation. And many of my friends afterwards apologized. They were ashamed that they had done that. But remember the political climate? They were being ostracized on a public basis, on a public level. It's just gay men. They should just all be allowed to die. Of course, when I get to Africa, I saw all these children with it, and I saw women with it, and men with it. It wasn't a gay disease. It just happened to arise in a particular population in our country, whereas in the rest of the world, it was arising in the whole population. I don't think that there's anything particularly righteous or holy about me. It was wrong to not treat these patients. It was wrong to just write them off and not take care of them, just as it's wrong not to take care of Jehovah's Witnesses.
Because of the politics and because of what was happening here in the United States, did that have an impact or influence on your coming out?
Oh, I think it did. As I said, I was pretty closeted, and in 1981, 1982, this was just the beginning of the AIDS epidemic. And of course, women, nobody ever thinks about women being gay. One of my favorite things about 19th century women is that they all lived in Boston marriages. And it was perfectly okay for women to live together in a Boston marriage. And it wasn't until Freud talked about women liking sex that people said, wait, women like sex? Those women living together, they might have sex. And then Boston marriages became a pariah. So fast forward to 1980, 81, it was the gay men getting the disease. But many of these were my friends, and many of them very close friends. In fact, we talked about our parents. Our parents, although they were conservative in the sense that they had eerie values, they were very liberal in many other ways. I was in San Francisco with a friend who was dying of AIDS when my mother called me to announce that she and my father had resigned from the Republican Party because of the speech that one of these radical right-wing fundamentalist preachers had given at the Republican National Convention about all the gay people should go to hell and all of that. So my parents also stood up for things, and my grandparents obviously did, and I think that I adopted a lot of that.
Turning back to an audience question, and we're nearly out of time, but a lot of folks are so curious about artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence in healthcare. What excites you? What concerns you?
Well, healthcare is a complicated thing. I think that the artificial intelligence is going to do a lot of sifting for us in terms of probabilities of what, say somebody comes in and they have a low blood count. I can pretty much tell you what's going to cause a low blood count, but an artificial intelligence can whip together instantly for anybody like the 12 or 13 most frequent causes of that. The problem is teasing it out into what's likely versus what's probable. And the more away from the computer people are, the better they get care. How many of you have gone to the doctor's office and he sits there typing at his computer the whole time that you're there talking to him? I mean, yeah, that's your common thing. I can remember when the doctor looked at you and they talked to you and they got up and they examined you. And what do you do when you examine someone? You touch them. And that touch is a crucial part of healing. And the Brigham and Mass General, two of the major intellectual nexuses of the United States, has just introduced a whole new artificial intelligence primary care practitioner project, where your primary care doctor is going to be an artificial intelligence. And they can't touch you. They can't know you. They can't read between the lines of what you're telling them, and that's what you miss. The smartest doctor I ever worked for took a course on dermatology at the University of Indiana when I was a sophomore, and he said, I'm a really smart doctor, and I could stand in the room and look in the room and I can tell you what the patient has. He says, but they don't care that I know what they have. They want to know that I know. So you have to go in the room. You have to sit down on an exam table, on the stool, and you have the patient on the exam table. So they're above you and you're below them. And you have to listen to them, even if what they're telling you has nothing to do with anything that you want to know about. You have to listen to them, ask them a few of the pertinent questions, and then look at what they show you and touch it. And I said, touch everything? He said, well, you can touch next to it if you don't want to touch it. But you've got to sit below them so they're above you. That gives them power. You have to listen to them so they have agency, and then you have to touch them so they know you care. And I did that through my whole career, and I think that had as much to do with anything as what I did. And that's what I'm still telling my medical students. Carolyn's trying to do it to her medical students, and most of them will say, well, there's not really any clinical trials that show that's important.
So, Dr. Petro, as we wrap up tonight, an educator, a medical professional, an author, a researcher, trailblazer, a person of many accomplishments and talent, there's so much to be inspired by with your story and in your overcoming obstacles and your saying yes, the power of yes. So the last question I want to leave us with here tonight, and before you answer it, I'll give some notes to our audience. But the last question is, for somebody in the audience, whether they're 18, 28, 48, or 88, thinking, I think I can, I think I can, I think I can. They're the little engine that could. What note of encouragement, what note of inspiration do you leave them with? Now, before you answer that, of course, we want to thank all of you for coming out tonight. Our second of many Global Summit events in Global Summit 2025, our 17th. In fact, we have another program, a partnership program with Gannon University for Gannon Reads on Thursday night down at the Warner Theater. That's at 7 o'clock. Next week, we have 3 upcoming events. We have Monday that I want to highlight down at Gannon University Yale Room with the executive director of the George Washington Library at Mount Vernon, Lindsay Shervinsky, and critically acclaimed author Chris Whipple. We're taking a look at the American presidency at 250. I think there's plenty to talk about of where we've gone from Washington to Trump and everything in between. 2 people looking at the past and the present, helping us to make sense of that. Of course, that event and so many more can be found on our website, jeserie.org. We appreciate you being here tonight. Before you applaud, let's get that answer, that encouragement. Somebody who's almost about to find their yes. I think I can, I think I can. What note do you leave them with?
Well, first of all, give your grandchildren that book if you haven't yet, or your great-grandchildren that book. I think for me, it's I think I can. Do I want to? Will it be fun?
Do I think I can? Do I want to? Will it be fun? Tonight has been so much fun. Dr. Jane Arbuckle Petro, thank you for coming to Erie, Pennsylvania. Folks, thanks for joining us at the Global Summit. We'll see you back again for more events. Good night.